My name is Jessica Greer, and we are going to talk about how to write a personal narrative. Something that most people are used to writing is nonfiction. All through high school and college, you are required to write research paper and analytical papers, but they don't really help you to write for the real world or help you figure out what people want to read. Depending on the type of paper you're going to want to accomplish, research will be required. The structure of nonfiction is different depending on what you are writing, and I will work through the writing a personal narrative with you, not just nonfiction. Our learning goals will be to make sure we understand what nonfiction consists of, learning how to identify your audience, incorporate a setting, and make sure our work flows from beginning to end. Since this is an online lecture and I cannot grade work that is being done at the present time, there are questions you can ask yourself along the way to make sure that you are getting it correctly. Does the reader know when the time frame is, place that the story is being held in, and can the reader determine why you wrote the story? What is the purpose? And after you are finished writing these personal narratives, you will just have to read it, reread it, and reread it again and make sure all those questions are answered. And if they are, you will have done the learning activity for yourself without anybody else doing it for you. First thing we're going to go over is what is nonfiction. According to Webster's dictionary, nonfiction is writing or cinema that is fact or real life events. Examples of nonfiction are names, although you will have to be careful with that because some people don't want their real names to be out in the public world. Places, these are physical places you have been to. For example, I grew up in a city called Garfield. It is right outside Cleveland, Ohio. The name is funny, but it is a real place. Time, that consists of how long something happened, the time period from one thing to another, and also putting in ages, since it's going to be personal and it's about you. What was the age that this took place in, and what is the age that the next event took place in? Does the event last for 1 year or 5 years? What years did it take place? For example, I told you where I grew up. I grew up in Garfield, but I did not move there until I was 9 or almost 10. The year that we moved there was 1996, and I moved away when I transferred to Ohio State in 2007. That is both an example of time and a setting. I gave a time frame based on age and numbers by the dates. Therefore, my reader will not have to do math to figure out how old I was or what the dates were, and that is something that you want to make sure that you do for them. You don't want to have somebody reading your personal narrative and you just have a bunch of dates and you started off with an age and then they are supposed to add and subtract to figure out when you were somewhere at a certain time, at a certain age. You want to provide all that for them. Things that happen in our lives or in the lives of the person you're writing about, these events cannot be exaggerated. They need to be based on real things that happened. I graduated from Ohio State after my last final. I did not go to graduation. I packed up my car, drove 9 hours from Ohio to North Carolina. This is true, not exaggerated. Maybe a little dramatic on my end for not going to graduation, but it still happened. And again, I am still going through all of my places, my timeline, and then I'm also setting the scene from one state to another because my life does not just take place in one area. It takes place from one state to another, and everything that happens in my life is either one place or another, and I have to continue to make sure that my reader will know what event takes place, where, and when. No guessing. I need to figure out who I'm speaking to. This is the beginning of my work. The beginning is not the first word in a book or on a page in a magazine or on the internet. If I'm doing a blog, the first thing I have to do is figure out who I'm writing for. I need to narrow down by researching what kind of story I want to write, find out what the target group is for my story, and figure out if there are other stories that are similar to the one that I want to tell. Targeting the right audience might be hard to make sure that I focus, or it might be hard, so I need to make sure that I focus on individuals that are going to be hanging out in a certain area that I find that my story would be important to them or significant for them to read and or hear. Starting the writing process. First, once I figure out who I'm going to be targeting, I need to make sure that I have a purpose for that specific audience. Is this going to be helpful? Is it going to be informative? Is it going to be humorous? Is it going to be something that will make sure that it takes their mind off of their daily lives? What is the purpose? So once you got the audience, you got to do the purpose. Once you determine this, you will need to have a clear idea where you want to start and where you want to end. Making a timeline and placing important dates on a timeline with description of what is significant about that date will be beneficial. Therefore, you will always remember what's first, next, last, and everything in between. Next is the setting. This is more than where is it taking place and less of the colorful language that we read about in novels. Unless it is important or significant to your specific story, we don't necessarily need to know that it is cold or sunny, below zero, windy, fall, autumn. Unless all of that has a specific significance to that part or event in the story, we don't need to know those things. Add the supporting characters. In the story, if the story is about you, you start with what you're doing and the time and place, and you start with adding people that are significant to that event. This is something that you will have to remember to keep up with, since people lose and gain friends throughout their lives. One friend may be important in the beginning of the story, but not necessarily in the end of the story. Sometimes having a character sheet to make sure that we put events with people or people with the events on the timeline will be helpful too. That way, when you get to an event, you can say, oh, this person was there for me, or this person was there not during this time, but one of these times. It also is important that if you're doing a story about somebody else, that you make sure that you have all the people that they think that are important too. Making the narrative personal is something that we need to do because it is a personal narrative. Reminisce about events that happened. If you need help remembering what made something special or significant, look at old pictures, videos, and talk to people who went through the event with you. Some events may be too small, some events may be way too big and may need their own chapter or own place, but everything has to be significant and have a purpose, and the purpose has to match with the purpose of the story as a whole. Add emotion to your narrative. It is not only important to remember the events accurately, but how did that event make you feel, and were you happy, were you sad? Why were you those things? Was it because of how you were raised? Was it because the outcome was different than what you expected? All those are important and they make that personal. Add the turning point after you have figured out what you're going to write about. Once you have decided what the purpose is and you make your timeline, you will have to identify the turning point. Things are going one way and then a major event happens and things have shifted into something else. Make sure you address why this is a big deal for you specifically. That will also help make it personal. After the turning point, what aspects of the main character change? This is about you. How and in what ways did you change from the beginning to the middle to the end? If you're writing about somebody else, make sure you continue to ask them questions so you get the full picture of what happened after the turning points. How does it flow is the last thing you will have to be worried about. This is where you can use a learning objective that we talked about before. In the beginning to the end, does your narrative make sense? Are all the questions answered? The when, the where, the why, the how, and what happened What happened next? Are all those questions answered? If not, make sure you answer them. If there is no answer, then you may want to take a step back and re-answer those questions and look at the situation from a different angle. Looking at things from a different angle will help you realize what questions need to be answered and which ones you didn't fully answer. If all those questions are answered and there's nothing else missing and you feel like you've answered everything as best as you can, then congratulations. You have written a personal narrative and it flows without holes throughout it. If not, then go back and rework it. Everything has many angles and can be looked at from many different ways. Conclusion, always read, and reread again. If you can read a novel, then you can read your own work since you've already been through it. Make sure that what you write is always the truth and nothing is exaggerated. Honesty is the best way to go. Make sure you answer all the questions throughout your writing. This way, nothing is left out. Make sure that you respect people and do not use their first names or their addresses or personal information. And lastly, have fun with it and make sure that it has a purpose. It is a personal narrative and it must have a purpose.